Hello, lovelies. Well, jeepers, right? A girl misses a podcast for a week and World War III breaks out. Lord, remind me not to miss any more weeks. Oh my God, not that it's my fault, of course, but it is really interesting. And I just want to say to all of you who are listening, bless you, because I know the last thing that I'm listening to right now or looking up on BitChute or YouTube or Telegram is stuff about ancient Egypt. That being said, there are a handful of people that do believe that ancient Egypt might be the most important thing to be asking questions about today. Hermes Trismegistus for one, Jeremy Nadler, for example, that I spoke about in episode 1, in fact, John Anthony West, and Chance Gardner, of course, and this young lady, Bebee. I got a question this week from a young lady who is a new follower. Bebee is her name. So hello, Bebee. Hello, darling. I hope you're listening to this. And she asked me a question, or a series of questions. And as Chance put it, these might be the most important questions in the world. So despite diseases and their solutions, and wars and their solutions, Chance is of the belief that the most important thing is for us to realize what has actually been stolen from us. And he believes that it's the most important thing in the world and that it could actually solve all of these. So when Bebee asked this question, I decided to go to the big guns and have him answer this question for Bebee. And I thought the answer was great. So I hope you all enjoy this from the one and only Mr. Chance Gardner.
This is a response to a 3-part question that was put to Bernays by a viewer of the show that recently had a bit of an epiphany and a recognition of this important dynamic that exists with regard to our past. First of all, congratulations on this question. It is the most important question that there is in history and in Egyptology, and for reasons that I'll explain, it might be the most important question that anyone can ask in modern society. And it is the most obvious thing that any high-functioning, intelligent, conscious person would ask, because it is the primary riddle that's presented by ancient Egypt. When you go to ancient Egypt and actually look at the expressions of beauty and knowledge, of intelligence and incredible anomalous sophistication that you see there, and then you compare that to the model of our past and the things they say about ancient Egypt that we were taught in school, the two just don't jive. The traditional explanation of ancient Egypt and of our past just does not reconcile with the brilliance and the genius that we see expressed in ancient Egypt. And so our viewer that posed these questions is exactly right in pointing out this crux of cognitive dissonance that most intelligent people experience when they actually come face to face with these ancient mysteries. I sat down initially and, off the top of my head, delivered this sort of rambling screed that was a bit of an Indra's net of all of the varying, numerous elements that interacted to weave the tapestry behind this riddle. But it took about 90 minutes, and it made me sound insane and was an extremely trying ear beating that I am happy to send out if you want to hear every single painful detail. But I sat down after that and just wrote a list of bullet points, and I'll try as succinctly as possible to cut that 90 minutes down into something a little more manageable. The 3 questions that were posed were roughly this. Why won't the West recognize the scientific and intellectual sophistication that's demonstrated in ancient Egypt? Secondly, why was this information suppressed? And thirdly, why won't it be acknowledged that Egypt is the source of such an important body of information? So I've broken this up into these sections, and let's see if I can answer them in a more succinct manner. The first question involves the riddle of ancient Egypt, which is, why is the model of the Orthodox explanation of ancient Egypt so different than what we recognize when we actually go and look at it, when we study it from the perspectives of art or architecture or engineering or science or medicine or psychology? It seems the more fields we bring to bear on this, the more untenable the Orthodox interpretation of Egypt becomes. So why won't the West recognize this place for being an expression of such incredible scientific and intellectual sophistication? My answer is this. First of all, there is an anomalously sophisticated science and an unexplainably elevated intellect that's demonstrated in ancient Egypt. It's demonstrated through mathematics. It's demonstrated through beautiful and incredibly elevated, sophisticated art. And in particular, this weird synergy of science and art that's not really present in the modern world, where the most important principles of their ancient science are incorporated into the art. It's encrypted in this way that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And in fact, in the course of producing the Magical Egypt series, we conducted a 10-year research project, and the research project kind of self-described as a forensic recreation of ancient science through a study of ancient art and symbolism. There are certain ways of looking at art. There are certain languages of art. There are certain traditions of artwork that artists are trained to recognize that aren't really in the wheelhouse of most historians. And so when a certain type of artist or architect or engineer or mathematician, for that matter, looks at Egypt, these things cry out as like being the equivalent of the space shuttle, but they exist in this time where Orthodox history tells us that it was very primitive and, the very beginnings of human technology or of human civilization, when in fact the actual evidence is anything but. Modern Egyptology and Orthodox history is adamant that a recognition of these anomalous expressions of science and intellect, their projections, their delusions, their fantasy. I hear the term confirmation bias quite a lot. As more and more discoveries are made, it gets harder and harder to deny, but when human egos and territorialism and educational hierarchies and pecking order and funding and recognition are involved, a lot of these are issues of basic human ego, that there are a lot of seeming motivations to not being wrong, to not admit to being wrong. They're not good reasons, but they're understandable reasons. If you started out with some incorrect basic assumptions, then the people that follow in the footsteps of the initial Egyptologists, a lot of perfectly intelligent, reasonable, ethical researchers continue walking in the direction that was forced by these initial incorrect assumptions. So there are actually two different models, two different major models, two different ways of looking at ancient Egypt, two different kind of decoder rings or two different filters through which you can look at Egypt. And the difference is with the basic premises of each one. And I'll just take a minute to talk about that. In one model, it holds that there's a linear model of human development where in the past we were primitive and we were superstitious savages. And there was a linear progression if you charted it on a graph that would start very low intelligence and low technology. And as time goes by, this line would be a ramp and just continually increase so that you get to our modern time and we're the smartest and most technologically advanced that we've ever been. And the farther back in time, the lower this intellect and technological ability is. So you get this linear line of progression of civilization and intellect and technology. The other model, the opposing model, which is the model that's held in the second way of looking at Egypt, the opposing interpretation of ancient Egypt, is more like a sine wave that rises and falls over and over again. And we can see this in things like how elevated and technological, how beautiful and accomplished and smart and philosophical the Greek and Roman Empire. And then after that, we fell into the Dark Ages and we fell hard and we fell far and we went back to living in the mud, and science, or the highest medicine was amputation, and everyone lived in grass huts. And there was not, for some reason, and different people diverge on reasons why the Greek and Roman empires fell and why we fell into the Dark Ages. And it took us so long to pull ourselves out of the Dark Ages and into the Enlightenment, where after that we experienced another high watermark in the sine wave. And so just in recent history, we can see examples of incredibly high technological accomplishments and high watermarks in civilization, followed by extremely low eras. And regardless of what the reasons are, it's very demonstrable that as time goes by, humanity can elevate to great heights and then fall to great depths for cultural reasons, for geological catastrophe reasons, for all kinds of reasons. So the second model of ancient Egypt that I call the symbolist, or my mentor, John Anthony West, used to call the heretical model, it has the distinction of much closer fit to the actual evidence that we see. It is the thing that really perfectly describes the genius and the technology that we see in ancient Egypt that, for whatever reason, Orthodox Egyptology and Orthodox history doesn't want to acknowledge. And they seem to want to go down with the ship and never give in and say we were wrong. They were much smarter than we thought. And we do see evidence of all these high sciences. They just don't acknowledge that. Little things like the use of the Fibonacci numbers in architecture and the golden section. Artists will know both of these things as being kind of the templates and generators of beauty, but also great structural stability in architecture. Orthodox Egyptology literally doesn't acknowledge that these things even exist, but it's perfectly possible to go and get blueprints that were made in, the 17th, 18th century. And it shows the measurements, and it shows that these temples were based on Fibonacci sequences and golden sections and a number of other very complex mathematical formulae that encode, or at least are an expression of a much more sophisticated science than they're given credit for. In addition to that, the papyri and the hieroglyphs and the models, we'll talk about this at more length, but they all talk in this symbolic language, this aesthetic symbolic language. They specifically are there to radiate, to transmit, to encrypt and immortalize this amazing ancient science that if you know how to read the art, if you know how to look at art, if you understand the principles of symbolic and didactic architecture, which means architecture that's meant to teach, then there's no question that these places express this amazing, incredibly sophisticated merging of technology and science and intellect and psychology and theology and this sort of holistic science. So there was a figure. So let's talk about these two models, these two interpretations of ancient Egypt. And there was a moment in history where the two diverged, and it was quite a acrimonious divergence of the two ideas, of the two opinions of ancient Egypt. There was a remarkable character named Schwaller de Lubicz, who was a polymath, who was a Renaissance man like many of the people of that day, that he had such an education. He was an accomplished mathematician. He was a chemist. He was a modern day alchemist, which you don't hear very often. But, alchemy was one of the forefathers of chemistry and medicine today. He also was at one point the head of the Theosophical Society and was incredibly steeped in ancient and occult and esoteric symbolism, and was very well versed in Vedic and Hindu symbolism as well as Buddhist and Hindu symbolism. And as an accomplished artist, as well as a mathematician, and as well as having all of these other disciplines under his belt, he was able to recognize that in Egypt there was a synergy of these incredibly diverse and very sophisticated sciences that were completely outside the wheelhouse of just a historian, especially, 18th, 17th, 18th century Egyptologists. It was quite a primitive science, and really literally didn't exist before Egyptology as a science was said to have been named and basically invented by Champollion when he translated the Rosetta Stone at the Turin Museum. And it was done from a very European perspective, and it was done with the mentality at the time that modern Europeans and basically these highly educated white men were the smartest and most sophisticated that had ever been. And they sort of look down, and you can kind of catch hints of racism and dismissive attitude towards people of the past, and especially people of other cultures that weren't as educated as these, in many cases, Oxford and Cambridge educated scientists and scholars. So young Egyptology being what it was, there was a figure by the name of Adrian Drieton who was considered the preeminent Egyptologist at the time. And like most scientists and specialists, he had a bit of an ego and had certain ideas that he was pursuing and working through theories and whatnot. And he was working at Luxor in Egypt in the ruins. And at the same time, Schwaller de Lubicz was there. And they would often butt heads. And as they both started to publish their work, Adrian Drieton published this picture of Egypt that's more or less what is Orthodox Egyptology today. Schwaller de Lubicz painted this entirely other picture of Egypt as being the expression of this incredibly sophisticated science that was very technologically advanced, very scientifically advanced. And it was a very particular kind of science that, oddly enough, in our modern science, it's not unknown. You can hear people talk about this. And for all of our advancement in modern science, the one thing that we cannot understand and the one answer that we can't seem to find is, what is consciousness? No one really understands what consciousness even is, this idea of me, the self-awareness. And there are people who try and minimize consciousness to say it's entirely this mechanical byproduct of electromagnetism and chemicals in our head, but that really falls flat. And for most honest scientists, they will admit we have no idea after all this time what consciousness even is. There's all kinds of other questions we can answer with modern science, but that's the one that just seems to elude our modern science. In the science of the ancients, the notable difference is that the entire focus of ancient science seemed to be in service of answering the one question that modern science can't answer, which is the nature and the structure and the purpose of consciousness, how consciousness fits into the mechanical and into the physical universe. That ancient Egypt and much of the other ancient cultures seem to be a giant expression of this body of knowledge that specifically addresses the mystery of consciousness. And it doesn't just do it through a description of biology. It does another thing that we literally still don't know. The best scientists and the most advanced work in Cambridge and what's the one in San Francisco, Harvard University, are just now starting to extend feelers into the most rudimentary understanding of what parts of the brain are involved in what aspects of consciousness. But as I said, the art and the science in ancient Egypt were unified, synergized in this amazing way, so that through the art and through the symbolism and through the mythos that were associated with certain gods and the dynamic interrelationships between the gods, this was all an allegory for the different components and aspects of consciousness. And beyond this, the art, especially the sculpture, as we demonstrate in season 2, the sculpture of ancient Egypt actually serves as physical biological models for this very specific part of the brain called the brainstem and the diencephalon. So the sculptures were made in this beautiful way. It's a kind of art that's known as Gestalt switch, where if you look at it one way, it's an old lady, and the same illustration, if you kind of blink your eyes and shake your head and look at it another way, is a young lady, or in one way, it's a duck, and then you look again and it's a rabbit. And it's the same picture, but it's two different images at once. That's called a Gestalt switch, and you switch back and forth between the two images. Egypt used a version of Gestalt switch in not just their hieroglyphs, but also in their sculpture. And they incorporated these incredibly sophisticated and absolutely medically accurate models of the brainstem, specifically in the context of talking about the origins of consciousness and intelligence. And so one of the researchers on our research team, Brad Clausen, made this initial discovery that shows a series of sculptures that were exactly the size and it had the exact shapes and the articulations of the brainstem, the thalamus, the pituitary, the pineal gland, and the hemispheres of the cerebrum. And they were stylized in this way so that they were a collection of recognizable objects. But when you did the Gestalt switch, they were also this perfectly medically accurate model of the brainstem and whatnot. And it wasn't just for a biology lesson, but it was part of relaying where consciousness comes from, where the crossover, where the meat becomes mind, the crossover between the biology that produces the subjective experience of consciousness. And so very much like the Hindu culture and its emphasis on the third eye, which is also present in the Buddhist culture, which is present in the Aztec, Olmec, Mayan culture, this reverence for the third eye. It showed the actual biology of this and drew special attention to this part of the brain in the very center called the diencephalon, which is known as the third eye. And when you look at a sliced section of the brain, it actually looks like an eye. And the Egyptian eye that we see, that is the eye of Horus, that suggests consciousness and knowing and all seeing, is a physical representation of this part of our brain that is our kind of inner eye in the sense that it's the mechanism that produces consciousness. And it seems like insane, like science fiction, but it's absolutely there and it's absolutely provable, because whether you believe it or not, you can take these sculptures and you can use them if you're a medical student to understand and to point out every single articulation and every component of the brain that produces our experience of consciousness, including this special relationship between the pineal gland, the pituitary, and the thalamus that is, oddly enough, is the basis of the Holy Trinity in Christianity, the Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, Godhead Trinity in Hinduism. And you can see that this ancient science is the basis for later, what we call religion. Religion, by the way, through the course of this, we'll start to understand that whole term, religion or theology, is a very dismissive and kind of misdirecting term, that we're not really looking at a religious expression here. We're looking at a scientific expression that is dismissed or diminished by calling it religion. So the alternative model or the alternative view of Egypt, the symbolist view of Egypt, that John Anthony West called the heretics or the heretical view, is considerably different than the assessment and the picture of ancient Egypt that Orthodox Egyptology admits. And so through what might be just basic territorialism, the unwillingness to admit that they were wrong. As both sides started publishing their work and the pictures painted such a different picture, incredible animosity arose between the two different camps or the two different views of ancient Egypt, which led to this famous moment where Adrian Drieton, the champion of Orthodox Egypt, issued this directive. They couldn't, because Schwaller's work was so scientifically perfect, he was such a careful scholar, they couldn't dismiss his work, they couldn't discredit his work, they couldn't prove that it was wrong. So they decided to do something that is still in existence today. Adrian Drieton uttered this famous sentence, "Let's erect a common wall of silence around the work of Schwaller de Lübeck's." They could never disprove it, but they could ignore it. And so from that time, it created a rift between the two that still exists today. The Orthodox view of Egypt, that they were simple savages, because a lot of the science that we later were able to recognize, they didn't even understand back in the 17 and 1800s. So they, to this day, they still seem to want to go down with the ship of absolutely denying that all these sophisticated sciences exist in Egypt, but it's become impossible to deny. And at this point, when the old school people get up to do a debate, frequently, in one famous case, Zahi Hawass, the minister of antiquities at the time of Egypt, stopped doing debates because he'd started getting laughed off stage, that he just got up and all he did was personal attacks, called people pyramidiots. And, when you run out of intellectual bullets, it's when you start resorting to name calling because you can't produce actual scientific evidence to refute the person's argument. So there was this rift basically between Orthodox Egyptology and the symbolist interpretation of Egypt that for all of these reasons, none of them were particularly good. It explains why Orthodox Egyptology and Orthodox history absolutely hates the idea that they've been wrong and started out with some basic incorrect assumptions about ancient Egypt. So let's see. The message transmitted in the art and the architecture is a science and not a religion. So the focus of the science, as I'd said, was not simply for the relaying of biology, some curious facts about biology or the structure of the brain, but it showed the structure of the brain on the way to describing some incredibly specific things about consciousness itself. But the most important thing of all is that what this science all culminated in and pointed to is something, the thing that is not at all included or acknowledged in modern science, which is something that in the Magical Egypt series, we've begun to call the cosmic trigger. In series 2, we describe the physical science, the biology, and the biology of consciousness. In season 3, we move into something more specific and much stranger, and in my opinion, of course, much more important, but even further suppressed for reasons that we'll talk about here. And it has to do with this cosmic trigger. There's a thing that you can do, a self-initiated type of yogic activity. You can say it's fully covered and explained and not very mysterious at all in the timeless art and science of yoga. And it has to do with the ability to synergize the sexual system and the brain, the sexual system of the nerves and lymphatic system, the blood veins, endocrine system, and basic hormones, and the electromagnetic fields of the body, specifically in the brain and diencephalon, to create this biological or psychophysical catalyst event that causes a rapid and radical evolution, a kind of second puberty in consciousness. It produces a new higher octave of consciousness that in the Eastern traditions, in yoga and in the more esoteric aspects of Tantra and Kundalini and Buddhism, it's referred to as an enlightened state or samadhi. It's symbolized by lighting a candle or various types of light that you initiate. We even have the idea of the light bulb going off over the head when you have a really good idea. These ideas have been seeping into Western culture for quite some time. This whole thing is considered in the West to be nonsense or superstition or, mythological or figurative, this higher state of mind. But it's generally regarded in Eastern and Vedic cultures to be a very real and very achievable state of higher consciousness that occurs through the synergy of the sexual energy and the brain area known as the third eye or the diencephalon, which is this triad that includes the pineal gland, the pituitary, and the thalamus. This yogic work, this esoteric work, this occult work, involves the amplification of the magnetic fields that are generated by this holy triad termination points in the brain that are responsible for consciousness in its natural state, but can be manipulated through these ancient practices to create a higher elevated state of brain operation and higher cognitive operation. Some people think that it's caused or enabled by reunifying the functions of the two separated hemispheres into one interacting sort of super brain to use a sort of silly oversimplification. If you've ever read Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, he does an amazing study of how the two hemispheres in our brain work together but are quite separate. It's almost like we have two completely separate brains. Under certain circumstances, oddly enough, through the use of LSD and through tantric practices, there are moments where you can get the two hemispheres to join and act like one, and the style of operation, the consciousness that you achieve subjectively, the way that it works in this union is a completely different mode of operation and a subjectively very different type of consciousness that happens than a regular consciousness where it's two separate hemispheres acting sort of separately and connected by the corpus callosum. So it's not unknown. And what is known is that in those moments, these incredible flashes of insight, higher brain operation, intuition, artists, it's the moment of epiphany in artists. In the tantric traditions, this experience is known as the rising Kundalini or a Kundalini event. And it's often accompanied by this weird download of information and these momentary flashes of genius and insight that are really just a subjective experience of this higher octave of brain operation that is available to anybody, but it's just something that's not acknowledged in the West. So it's very odd, but a very marvelous and wonderful thing. And for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, it's quite suspect and odd that such an important and provable and amazing thing would be completely non-existent, completely withdrawn from the Western psyche, from Western conversation. The second part of this three-part question was, why won't the West recognize Egypt as the source of this wisdom? My answer to this is this. It's actually hard to say that Egypt was the actual source because the same anomalously sophisticated science seems to be in use by ancient Chinese, ancient Vedic or Indian, ancient Mayan, Aztec, Olmec, Toltec cultures of South America, and even is present in the artwork of the ancient ancestors of the Nordic and European cultures. Different scholars, and of course, was the subject of great fascination to intellectual titans, Pythagoras and Plato. Different scholars have forwarded different ideas of diffusion or the transfer of the information, where it came from, how it was diffused from one to another. And a lot of the most common models, and quite a few of them are contradictory, but the most common one involves the fact that a lot of doctors and scientists met and interacted, and kind of this information diffused in Persia under the courts of some of the great pashas there, where very educated men interacted with one another. And also the trade routes where the trading would occur and cultures would be exchanged. And there's a kind of diffusion of this information. Because these symbols are so recognizable, and because the symbols like the caduceus or the risen cobra that comes out of the forehead of the pharaoh, or all over Mayan and Inca and Aztec art, you see indications of the third eye and the rope that ties the two hemispheres together, and the use of snakes, and specifically located in the third eye. In Angkor Wat and in the Thai and the Vietnamese cultures, you see again this use of triangle at the third eye with snakes and fire, and all very minor variations of symbolism that all point and focus your attention on the specific part of the brain and this triad of interacting components. The symbolism of the snake that suggests the spinal column that directs sexual energy either downward to the reproductive organs or upward to the brain. Anyway, so you can see these recognizable symbols that are in place just about in every ancient culture in the world. And they're so similar, and they all exist in such early periods that it's very hard to say which one of these models of diffusion is correct. But there's a whole other model that I actually find much more satisfying that is not without precedent. It's the model that Schwaller de Lubicz and John Anthony West and the people in the symbolist model of Egypt talk about. And there was another champion of this. Plato himself wrote about this ancient culture, Atlantis. And Atlantis, a lot of crazy people bandy that word about. And it's a good way to get you kicked out of any serious scientific debate or sociological or historical debate. And it's hard to know if Atlantis was an actual place or was a word that signified this ancient global culture. But there was, in Plato's opinion, and Schwaller's opinion, and John Anthony West, and all of the people of this certain model recognized that there was a culture, a mother culture, pre-existing mother culture that existed before what Orthodox history will acknowledge as the beginnings of human civilization. That Orthodox history for the longest time held that nothing really of importance happened before 4500 BC. Once the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, these ruins in Turkey were discovered, even Orthodox dating of Göbekli Tepe says that this was in operation about 10,500 BC. So that Orthodox insistence that culture and history doesn't go back beyond 4,000 years, that was absolutely proven to be completely incorrect. And so it's becoming, as time goes by and more scientists are weighing in on this, it's harder and harder to hold the orthodox view. And it's looking more and more likely that there was this pre-existing culture that our Western culture doesn't acknowledge, but that it was called Atlantis, or different people call it different names, but that it was a very vast and long-lasting culture, and that just basic human intelligence over an incredibly long period of time had developed and answered all these questions, and had constructed this unified science. And then because of either sociological or environmental reasons of catastrophe, the civilization was destroyed. Plato talks about it as being breaking up and sinking down into the ocean. And the few survivors that lived through this or survived this cataclysm spread to the four ends of the earth and became the kind of progenitors of this knowledge as humanity picked itself up again and re-flourished and re-dispersed throughout the world, carrying this legacy of this incredibly ancient science that was developed by this ancient culture that Plato called Atlantis. So the idea of the origin of this science is, I think, best answered by the idea that there was a pre-existing mother culture that had this perfect version of this science. And then when it was broken apart by cataclysm, it was dispersed and scattered to the four winds. And that is why in ancient Chinese history and ancient Vedic and Indian history and the Mayan, Olmec, Toltec cultures in ancient Egypt, Babylonian, Sumeria, they all had this slightly varying versions like you'd expect if, the same information was dispersed in different cultures, passed it down. So that answer of recognizing Egypt as the source of the wisdom, I would have to acknowledge that, in my opinion, at least from an aesthetic standpoint, Egypt was the highest, most sophisticated expression. It was the most beautiful and the most intelligent expression of this art. But it seems that the actual origin of this art was a pre-existing mother culture. Now, the final question is, why was this information suppressed? There's quite a lot to this, and it's a fairly deep conversation, but I can summarize it very quickly and very brutally. And this is my take on this, and there are a number of other people who will tell you a version of this, but in the 15 years or so that I've been studying this and trying to answer this very same question myself, this is where I've sort of landed on all this. And it is this, that the core tenets of this ancient science involve this hybridization, but it's a science whose central pillar rests on the integration of sexuality used in its higher octaves, not in procreative sex, but through a higher octave use or purpose, to synergize with the central mechanisms of consciousness, the biological components that create consciousness, to create this self-initiated, rapid, and radical evolution of personal consciousness. It's this thing that in the show we're calling the cosmic trigger. It's a physical mechanism, and it is very much like a trigger that causes a catalytic, rapid evolution of personal consciousness. And it is done through the amplification of the magnetic fields of these three parts of the brain through these timeless practices that are encoded very clearly in yoga. You have to spend quite a lot of time in yoga to get to this place. But in Buddhism and yoga, in the Hindu and Vedic traditions, the Tantric and Kundalini traditions, this is this event, this self-initiated catalytic event that's symbolized by the snake and beautifully pictured as the risen cobra at the side of the third eye in the pharaoh, or of any elevated, completed person. It signifies a sort of second puberty, or like the ultimate cosmic finishing school, where you aren't a complete person. You're not a metaphysical adult until you've achieved this higher state of consciousness. And it is very much like a kind of meta puberty, that the old point of living, the actual highest purpose and highest quest to which a person can devote themselves, is pursuit of this event that involves a lot of work, spiritual purification, incredible exercise, mental exercises, and this physiopsychic catalytic event, this physiopsychic development that allows this event to happen. So here's where I think the problem occurs. Much later, Christianity spread through the world and did its best to stamp out pagan and the occult traditions. It very vilified them. You can see things in symbolism like St. George slaying the dragon, the use of Satan as a snake in the Garden of Eden. The whole symbolism of the Garden of Eden, by the way, this central tree, like the spine that has a snake in it, and this snake imparts incredible wisdom, but it's given at a cost. Christianity, in its very nature, vilifies what came before it. And the very worst, most forbidden parts of Christianity directly relate to this ancient practice. So Christianity involves the abdicating of this spiritual evolution or enlightenment to a theoretical higher being. And basically, you give yourself up and you let a third party, you let an external source elevate you. It's a very passive thing where some theoretical other will elevate you to this divine state if you give yourself up to it, while we remain passive. While the other system, the ancient system of Tantra or Kundalini, or, in the Hindu and the Buddhist systems, those systems are proactive. They're exactly the opposite. They require us to do the work, for us to find the trigger and to pull this cosmic trigger. It requires us to step up and catalyze this rapid evolution, this rapid expansion, this radical expansion of consciousness, to bring on a host of higher register sensory states that are generally believed in the West to be mythological or non-existent or supernatural. When you pull this cosmic trigger and you amplify the magnetic fields in your brain, and you, according to some models, you unify the two hemispheres, and you literally begin to, the brain operates on a higher octave. There's legendary accounts of people who've achieved this Kundalini state that experience a moment of genius, of download. People talk about wandering through the Akashic records and having this momentary visit with this field of all knowledge. And subjectively, this experience tends to, whatever your savantisms, whatever your natural geniuses or talents do, it tends to really accelerate those, and you will have this amazing, recognizable, rapid evolution in our expansion of consciousness. And it brings on a host of higher register sensory states that, as I say, are generally believed in the West to be imaginary, mythological or supernatural. But there are things that there's lots of historic accounts for, a heightened sense of intuition, anomalous cognition, which means knowing things that you shouldn't know, psychic abilities, the ability to know what other people are doing, things, knowing what's going to happen before they happen. And all these things that in the East and in the ancient world were believed to be higher aspects of consciousness that are just tools that are normal abilities, higher register sensory organs that happen when your brain is working on this higher octave. And this is not something supernatural or something mythological, but it's a basic thing that anyone can achieve in potential. It's these things that are waiting in everyone's psyche, and they're just outside of your reach because they lay dormant until you've gone through this ancient process to what we call metaphorically pull the cosmic trigger. So the answer to this question, to come back to the question, is basically the reason that this information was suppressed is because it echoes, and in my opinion, it validates the idea that the Hindu and the Buddhist traditions are correct, and that Christianity is a much later construction that, intentionally or not, is a giant misdirection. In many ways, an absolute negation or contradiction of the clear and universal principles that were set out in ancient Egypt and in Sumeria, in the Vedic and the Tantric and the Kundalini traditions, and in the Mayan and the Thai and the Vietnamese, and in the ancient Nordic, and even later in the Greek writings of Pythagoras and Plato, and even the Gnostic traditions. It's literally the opposite, the denial or negation of this timeless practice that used to be universal in all the religions. And then with the expansion and the eventual domination of Christianity in the Western world, was suppressed and eventually beaten out of existence, and has been effectively withdrawn from the Western world. I often, as presumably the person that asked this question, I often wonder, how could such an incredibly important event be completely withdrawn from the Western psyche? In the show, we talk about it as the long-lost owner's manual for the human psyche. And the reason why we feel so incomplete, we feel so hollow, we feel so pointless, is that this thing that was the central pinnacle of human experience is no longer available to us. And so it's hard to miss that in the absence of this, we run around like idiots. We fight with each other. We're easily ruled. We're easily subjugated. And no one knows what they're supposed to be doing. Nothing makes sense, and there's no point to anything. If I could offer a brief aside here, my own experience, my education, and my whole life was spent in the field of advertising, my whole young life. And there's a basic tenet of advertising that anybody with any kind of education in advertising knows, this idea that in advertising, it's generally acknowledged that the more complete and fulfilled a person is, the less things they buy to fill the hole. which leads to this horrific situation we find ourselves in where it's just better business to keep most of society in a place where their basic needs aren't being met. So they have this unquenchable hunger for a satisfaction that they'll never achieve, that buying things, external objects and external motivators like status and acquiring of possessions and wealth provide a similar feeling, but never are quite satisfying in that ultimate way. And of course, it's very much like feeding styrofoam peanuts to a starving person. It kind of works and it sort of fills you up, but ultimately, because all the actual nutrition is absent, the person can be both completely full and still starve to death. I think this is possible if you were to go on a diet of nothing but fast food. You could eat every day and actually starve to death because you're not getting any actual nutrition. And so there's a character in advertising, considered the pioneer, considered a hero of early advertising, Edward Bernays. And Bernays pioneered and radically shifted the relationship of advertising to people and the presence of advertising in modern society. And what he did was use this lower octave of eros, the most brutal, brutish lower octave of sexual attraction. And specifically, well, what he did was he was the one that pioneered the idea of taking a woman in a bikini and putting her in front of a car. And he would elicit this brutish urge to reproduce and then redirect that towards the car. So you had this sexual, subliminal, brutish, animalistic attraction to an inanimate object that I guess you could have sex with it, but it's not really there to have sex with. But he would hijack your most primitive urge. And if you study Tantra and if you study the sacred sexuality, it is the higher octave of eros that is the thing that causes this psychic catalyst. And just as another aside, there's an amazing set of symbols that you see at Angkor Wat and in the Thai culture. And it's this a cluster of symbols that is called churning the Milky Ocean. And what the symbolism is that these demons and angels are playing a game of tug war with this snake, this infinitely long snake. And there's a lot of moving parts to this symbolism, but basically it talks about the fact that the spine in all the tantric symbolism from every culture, the spine is the snake. Your upper end, your mental, your brain basically has a need for the sexual energy. If you can divert the sexual energy up into the brain, you can catalyze this, you can pull the cosmic trigger and you can catalyze this advancement, this sort of meta puberty. And you can access these higher states of consciousness. If you go the other way, if you let the demons win the tug of war, then your sexuality goes downward. It's expended in the sexual act. And all this life force goes to creating a new life, or it goes towards nothing if you're just having idle sex for the fun of it. And so it incredibly intelligently incorporates this dynamic as a tug of war between angels and demons. Both of them want to use the sexual energy. One group wants to use it for a higher purpose. One group wants to use it for a lower purpose. So now going back to Edward Bernays turned our entire culture into this machine where demons pulled your sexuality out through the bottom, sexually obsessed you and diverted you into cars or washing machines or blenders or whatever. It was amazing the things that he would put bikini models in front of for the purpose of advertising. And one final note on that, when we were shooting series 3 of Magical Egypt, we went to Angkor Wat and we went to some of the Thai palaces in Thailand. And one of the things we studied was the stupas, these strange Eastern temples that were not even structures that people could be in, but they were kind of these vertical sculptures. And when you understand the symbolism of the stupa, it's a vertical axis that is like your ladder to heaven, your stairway to heaven. And the way that you elevate out of being a human and towards being a deva and a god ultimately is by relinquishing your attachments, relinquishing your desires. All of your associations and all your desires are literally the chains that keep you trapped in this lower animal nature of physical humanity. And the more you can give up your desires and attachments, the higher you go until ultimately you escape through the top of the structure, through the sun door, which is analogous to escaping through the top of the head, or the symbolism of the top chakra on the top of your head. And this is accomplished when you can finally give up the last of your desires and your attachments and your unhealthy obsessions to the physical world. And so it quite clearly shows this route and method to godhood. And when I was there, it really struck me that in the West, we live in a system that is exactly the opposite. We live in an entire system that keeps us chained to the lowest, brutalist mode of beastly existence, where our Western culture is literally a desire machine. It's an attachment machine. Every time you go out, every time you turn on the radio, every time you look at television or billboard, everything about our society is there to build and amplify and solidify our attachments and our desires to physical objects and physical status and wealth and your place on the pecking order of the corporate ladder. And it is literally the opposite. It is like this construction made by demons to keep your sexuality pulled to its lower polarity and to keep you chained to this torturous hell of eternally chasing and desiring these empty physical objects. When the ancient world, and throughout the entire ancient world, it instructed you that the real evolutionary path and the only gratifying thing to do with your life is to pull everything up, to pull yourself up and out through the sun door, to direct your sexuality up into the brain where it can merge and cause this catalytic event that is described in the Kundalini tradition. So at some point, the merger, anybody who's alive right now and watching what's happening with the merger of corporatism and politics and very probably the merger of corporate desires and organized religion. All of these things seem to be conspiring to keep us pulled down in our lowest, certainly our lowest chakras of fear and divisiveness. It's us versus them. It's vaxxed versus unvaxxed. It's Republicans versus Democrats. It's, whoever the two teams were that played in the Super Bowl. This kind of divisive, hateful, the opposite of unification, the opposite of lifting up to the higher chakras that are the universality of love. Instead of finding how we're different and hating you because you're different than me, hating you because you're on the right or hating you because you're on the left. Instead of that, the higher chakras symbolize the idea that I look past how we're different and I love you because of the ways that we're the same. And more than that, even higher than that, is that I stop paying attention to everything that happens outside of me and I pursue this ancient technology that was the core of every single religion in every ancient culture. I pursue the perfection of my consciousness in this elevation, this second puberty, this meta orgasm that happens in a Kundalini event to evolve my normal animalistic consciousness into this higher register of consciousness, the practice of which is called Tantra or the Kundalini event. And so that's kind of a long and rambling screed, but I think that addresses the 3 points of the question. There's something about the structure of our society that doesn't want us to remember this old technology. I'll end on a final note. Everyone's heard of Machiavelli, the Machiavellian principles that are laid out in his book, The Prince. It's a handbook of rulership, and it's a handbook of how a small number of wealthy, smart people can rule millions of people through the use of trickery and deception. And one of the fundamental things that Machiavelli says, if you want to rule someone, if you want to subjugate them, or if you want to destroy them utterly, the first thing you do is rob them of their history. The greatest golden road to subjugation of a people is to rob them of their history so they don't know who they are. And if you tend to look at this in this sort of dark way, it's a brilliant move to completely divorce us from our point of life, the purpose of life, and to completely withdraw from society this mechanism that every one of us has access to, this trigger that the only place you have sovereignty left in you is this mysterious room up in your head, and this trigger, it's there and it's waiting for everybody. And all you have to do is find it, go through these ancient practices to pull this trigger, and you elevate out of this state where you can be subjugated. It is like suddenly learning how to grow wings, and then all of these people who are making money off of you, all these people that are subjugating you and fooling you and stealing your true destiny and misdirecting you and keeping you wandering around like an idiot so that they can profit off of you. You no longer are subject to that once you know how to do this. You evolve into a state where you can't be bullied and you can't be subjugated. And in my own opinion, I think that may be why this most important information, this long lost birthright that is the long lost owner's manual for the human experience, I believe that's why this information is no longer present in the Western culture. But there's a saying, I'm not even sure where it comes from. It comes from everywhere, the Asian cultures and the Greeks. The saying goes, there's 3 things you can't hide: the sun, the moon, and the truth. And that even though this information has been withdrawn, one of the things that I consider the greatest accomplishment of Magical Egypt and of myself as an artist and as a human being who wants to restore this information, this long lost owner's manual for the human psyche, roadmap to finding and pulling your own cosmic trigger. It's impossible to hide. You can misdirect people. You can mislabel it. You can call it names, which seems to be all the rage these days. If you can't outsmart someone, you just call them a name. All of those mechanisms are in place to keep us from looking in the one place. As David Bowie said right before he died, in the center of it all, you are I. This is one thing that is there for everyone. It's just sitting there waiting for you to find it. And there's no authority figure that can keep you from doing it. And believe me, for some reason, they all want to try. They all keep trying. Anyway, I hope that answers your question. And as long as that was the first time I did it, it was 3 times longer. So I'll call that a win. Cheers to you, folks. Hope this helps.
Well, there you go. That is so Chance. I have to tell you a story. One time when we were doing commercial work back in the good old days, a client had a question for Chance. And Chance wrote an answer. And very much like in this case, he took the equivalent of 42 minutes of writing instead of 42 minutes of speaking to answer the question. And the client then forwarded the answer to me, and she said, "Is this a yes or a no? I don't have time for that." And so I literally wrote back and said, "That's a no." And she's like, "Thank God, thank you." But in this case, I have to say, I think he did a great job. So I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and more soon.